In the grand theatre of human nature, certain patterns emerge with the consistency of natural laws. Just as gravity pulls all objects toward Earth regardless of their composition, so too do psychological forces shape human behavior in predictable ways. Among these forces, one particular vulnerability manifests itself across all women, transcending culture, education, social status, and personal strength. This weakness is not a character flaw to be mocked, but rather a fundamental aspect of feminine psychology that, when properly understood, becomes a key to navigating the complex dynamics between men and women. The weakness in question is the deep, almost cellular need for emotional security and validation through connection. Unlike men who often derive their sense of worth from achievement, conquest, and independent action, women are neurologically wired to seek their primary validation through the quality of their relationships and their ability to maintain emotional bonds. This is not a conscious choice, but an evolutionary imperative that has been carved into the feminine psyche over millennia of survival and reproduction. Consider Sarah, a brilliant corporate lawyer who commands respect in boardrooms filled with intimidating executives. She can dissect complex legal arguments with surgical precision and negotiate million-dollar deals without flinching. Yet when her romantic partner withdraws emotionally or seems distant, this same formidable woman becomes consumed with anxiety. She analyzes every text message, every facial expression, every shift in tone. The woman who can face down hostile opponents in court finds herself paralyzed by the possibility of emotional abandonment. This pattern repeats itself endlessly. Take Maria, a successful surgeon whose steady hands have saved countless lives. In the operating room, she is a model of calm competence, making life and death decisions with unwavering confidence. But when she perceives that her teenage daughter is pulling away, or when her close friendship seems strained, Maria becomes a different person entirely. She lies awake at night replaying conversations, wondering if she said something wrong, desperately trying to decode the emotional temperature of her relationships. Or consider Jennifer, an entrepreneur who built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing. She took risks that would terrify most people, made bold decisions in the face of uncertainty, and persevered through failures that would have broken lesser spirits. Yet when her husband seems preoccupied, or when she senses tension in her marriage, Jennifer's confidence crumbles. The woman who conquered markets and competitors finds herself helpless against the specter of relational discord. The pattern is unmistakable. Regardless of their external accomplishments, intelligence, or apparent strength, women consistently reveal this fundamental vulnerability when it comes to threats to their emotional connections. They can be warriors in every other arena of life, but the possibility of losing love, approval, or emotional security strikes at their core in ways that few other challenges can match. This weakness manifests in countless ways throughout daily life. A woman might sacrifice her own needs and desires to avoid conflict, even when she knows she's being treated unfairly. She might stay in toxic relationships because the fear of being alone outweighs the pain of staying. She might compromise her values, dim her light, or abandon her dreams if she believes these sacrifices will preserve her connections with others. The biological roots of this tendency run deep. Throughout human evolution, women's survival and the survival of their offspring depended heavily on their ability to form and maintain cooperative relationships. Those who could build strong social networks, who could read emotional cues accurately, and who could inspire others to care for them and their children were more likely to pass on their genes. This evolutionary pressure created a psychological architecture that prioritizes relationship maintenance above almost everything else. Modern neuroscience confirms what evolutionary psychology suggests. Women's brains show greater connectivity between the emotional processing centers and the areas responsible for language and social cognition. They are literally wired to be more sensitive to social cues, more affected by relationship dynamics, and more motivated to maintain harmony in their interpersonal connections. This enhanced social sensitivity, while often a tremendous strength, also creates a corresponding vulnerability. The hormone oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, plays a crucial role in this dynamic. Women typically produce and respond to oxytocin more strongly than men, creating deeper emotional attachments and a greater sense of well-being from close relationships. When these bonds are threatened, the resulting distress is not merely psychological, but physiological. The body's stress response activates, flooding the system with cortisol and other stress hormones that can affect everything from sleep to immune function. Understanding this weakness is not about exploiting women or viewing them as inherently flawed. Rather, it's about recognizing a fundamental truth about human nature that affects roughly half the population. Just as understanding gravity allows us to build better bridges and design safer aircraft, understanding this psychological reality allows for more effective communication, deeper empathy, and more successful relationships. The key insight is that this weakness is both a vulnerability and a strength. The same emotional sensitivity that makes women susceptible to relationship anxiety also enables them to build deeper connections, show greater empathy, and create more nurturing environments. The challenge lies not in eliminating this aspect of feminine nature, but in learning to manage it constructively. For women themselves, awareness of this tendency can be liberating. When you understand that your intense reaction to relationship threats is not a personal failing but a natural consequence of your neurobiology, you can begin to develop strategies to manage these responses more effectively. You can learn to distinguish between genuine relationship problems that require attention and the anxiety-driven catastrophizing that often accompanies this psychological vulnerability. For men who want to build successful relationships with women, understanding this dynamic is equally crucial. The man who recognizes and respects this aspect of feminine psychology, who provides consistent emotional security and clear communication about his commitment and care, will find himself with a tremendous advantage in creating lasting, satisfying relationships. However, the man who fails to understand this weakness, who is careless with emotional security or who manipulates these vulnerabilities for short-term gain, will ultimately find himself dealing with the destructive consequences of triggering a woman's deepest fears. A woman who feels emotionally unsafe will deploy an array of defensive behaviors that can poison even the strongest relationship. The wise man learns to be a source of emotional stability and security, not because he wishes to control or manipulate, but because he understands that doing so creates an environment where both partners can thrive. When a woman feels genuinely secure in her emotional connections, her natural strengths flourish. She becomes more generous, more supportive, more creative, and more loving. This understanding also reveals why certain relationship dynamics are so common and so predictable. The pattern of pursuit and withdrawal that destroys many relationships often stems from misunderstanding this fundamental difference in psychological needs. The man who values independence and space may withdraw when he feels pressured, not realizing that this withdrawal triggers the woman's deepest insecurities. The woman, sensing his withdrawal, increases her efforts to reconnect, which the man experiences as additional pressure, causing him to withdraw further. Breaking these destructive cycles requires conscious awareness of these underlying psychological patterns. The man must understand that providing emotional security is not the same as surrendering his independence or authenticity. The woman must understand that her partner's need for space is not necessarily a threat to their connection. The truly successful relationships are those where both partners understand and work with these psychological realities rather than against them. The man provides consistent emotional security while maintaining his own integrity and boundaries. The woman learns to self-soothe and find internal sources of security while still honoring her need for connection. As we delve deeper into this exploration, we will examine how these dynamics play out in real-world situations and, more importantly, how understanding them can lead to greater personal power and more fulfilling relationships. But first, we must turn our attention to the other side of this equation, the weakness that exists within men, and how the destruction of this weakness becomes the foundation for true strength. Part 2. The path of self-destruction and rebirth. Every man carries within himself a fundamental weakness that, left unchecked, will destroy him as surely as water erodes stone. This weakness is not visible to the casual observer, nor does it announce itself with obvious signs. It lurks in the shadows of his psyche, manifesting as the desperate need for external validation, the fear of appearing weak or inadequate, and the compulsive drive to prove himself worthy in the eyes of others. The man who fails to identify and systematically destroy this weak self will remain forever vulnerable to manipulation, self-sabotage, and the whims of circumstance. The weak self is born in childhood, nurtured by society's expectations, and reinforced by every moment of doubt, every instance of seeking approval, every compromise of personal values for the sake of being liked or accepted. It is the voice that whispers, "What will they think?" when contemplating bold action. It is the hesitation before speaking truth that might offend. It is the desperate scramble for status symbols and external markers of success to mask internal feelings of inadequacy. Marcus discovered this truth in the most painful way possible. For 35 years, he had lived his life according to other people's expectations and definitions of success. He chose a career in finance not because he loved numbers or markets, but because his father respected wealth and his peers admired high earners. He married Rebecca not because she stirred his soul, but because she fit perfectly into the image of what a successful man's wife should be: beautiful, educated, socially connected. For years, Marcus climbed the corporate ladder with methodical determination, earning promotions and accumulating the trappings of success. He owned the right car, lived in the right neighborhood, belonged to the right clubs. From the outside, his life appeared to be the very definition of achievement. Yet, internally, Marcus felt hollow, like an actor playing a role he had never auditioned for. The facade began to crumble during his midlife crisis, that crucible where so many men either transform or destroy themselves. It started with small rebellions, staying out later than he should, flirting with women who were not his wife, making impulsive purchases that served no practical purpose. These were not the actions of a man pursuing his authentic desires, but rather the desperate thrashing of someone who suddenly realized he had never lived his own life. The breaking point came when Marcus lost his job during a corporate restructuring. Suddenly, stripped of his primary source of identity and external validation, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had no idea who he actually was beneath all the roles and expectations. His relationship with Rebecca, built on superficial compatibility rather than deep connection, began to deteriorate as his confidence wavered and his carefully maintained image started to crack. It was during this dark period that Marcus encountered an older man named David at a bar where he had taken to drinking alone. David was everything Marcus was not: comfortable in his own skin, indifferent to others' opinions, radiating a quiet confidence that came from within rather than from external achievements. Over several conversations, David helped Marcus see that his entire life had been built on a foundation of weakness disguised as strength. "You've spent your whole life trying to be the man you think you should be," David told him one evening. "But you've never asked yourself who you actually are or what you actually want. You're not living your life, you're performing it." This conversation marked the beginning of Marcus's journey toward destroying his weak self. The process was neither quick nor painless. It required him to systematically examine every aspect of his life and ask brutal questions: which of his beliefs were truly his own, and which had been inherited or adopted to gain approval? Which of his goals reflected his authentic desires, and which were simply society's prescription for a successful life? Which of his relationships were based on genuine connection, and which existed merely to maintain his image or provide external validation? The man who emerges from this process of systematic self-destruction and rebirth becomes fundamentally different from who he was before. He no longer seeks approval because he has learned to validate himself. He no longer fears judgment because he has accepted his own imperfections and limitations. He no longer compromises his values because he has developed an unshakable sense of his own worth that does not depend on others' opinions. This transformation affects every aspect of his interactions with the world. But perhaps nowhere is the change more evident than in his relationships with women. The weak man approaches women with a fundamental neediness that repels the very thing he seeks. He tries to impress rather than connect, to prove his worth rather than share his authentic self. He seeks validation through conquest or approval through submission, never recognizing that both approaches stem from the same underlying weakness. The strong man, the one who has destroyed his weak self, approaches relationships from a position of abundance rather than scarcity. He does not need a woman to complete him, because he has already become complete within himself. He does not seek validation through her desire for him because he has learned to validate himself. This fundamental shift in orientation creates an entirely different dynamic in his romantic relationships. Take the example of James, who underwent this transformation in his late 20s after a series of failed relationships that followed the same predictable pattern. In each case, he would begin with desperate pursuit, showering the woman with attention and gifts, constantly seeking reassurance about her feelings for him. Initially, this intensity might be mistaken for passion, but inevitably the woman would begin to feel suffocated by his neediness. As she started to pull away, James would increase his efforts, becoming more anxious and desperate, which only accelerated her retreat. The cycle would continue until either the woman ended the relationship or James would explode in frustration and anger, destroying what remained of their connection. Each failed relationship left him feeling more inadequate and desperate, which made him even less attractive to the next woman he pursued. The turning point came when James realized that his approach to relationships was fundamentally flawed. Instead of trying to find a woman who would validate his worth, he needed to develop his own sense of worth independent of external validation. Instead of seeking completion through another person, he needed to become complete within himself. This realization launched James on a journey of radical self-development. He began reading philosophy and psychology, not to impress others with his knowledge, but to understand himself and his place in the world. He took up challenging hobbies and pursuits that pushed him beyond his comfort zone, building confidence through genuine achievement rather than external recognition. He spent time in solitude, learning to enjoy his own company, and developing a rich internal life. Most importantly, James learned to sit with discomfort without immediately seeking external soothing. When he felt anxious or insecure, instead of calling friends for reassurance or seeking distraction through entertainment, he would examine these feelings with curiosity and compassion. He learned to self-soothe, to validate his own experiences, and to find strength in his own center. The transformation was not immediate or linear. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, times when the old patterns reasserted themselves. But gradually James developed what could only be called inner sovereignty, the ability to govern himself from within, rather than being buffeted by external circumstances or other people's reactions. When James began dating again, everything was different. He approached women with curiosity rather than need, interested in discovering who they were rather than trying to prove his worth to them. He was comfortable with silence, patient with uncertainty, and unshaken by the inevitable tests and challenges that arise in any developing relationship. The woman he eventually married, Sarah, later told him that what initially attracted her was not his looks or his success, but his presence, his complete comfort with himself and his lack of desperation. "You were the first man I met who didn't seem to need anything from me," she said. "That made me want to give you everything." This paradox lies at the heart of masculine strength. The man who needs nothing is given everything, while the man who desperately seeks validation finds only rejection and disappointment. The weak self seeks to take validation, approval, love, respect. The strong self naturally attracts these things because it radiates the confidence and self-possession that others find magnetic. The process of destroying the weak self is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. The man who has undergone this transformation must remain vigilant against the resurgence of old patterns. He must continually choose courage over comfort, authenticity over approval, self-validation over external validation. But with each choice, the new patterns become stronger, while the old patterns weaken. The rewards of this transformation extend far beyond romantic relationships. In business, the man who has destroyed his weak self negotiates from strength rather than desperation. He can walk away from bad deals because his self-worth is not tied to any particular outcome. He can take calculated risks because he is not paralyzed by the fear of failure or others' judgment. In friendships, he attracts deeper, more authentic connections because he no longer needs to maintain a false persona to be liked. He can disagree without being disagreeable, set boundaries without being defensive, and support others without losing himself. In solitude, he finds peace rather than anxiety because he has learned to be his own best company. He can pursue his authentic interests without worrying about others' approval, develop his unique gifts without needing external validation, and chart his own course without being swayed by popular opinion. The man who has successfully destroyed his weak self becomes, in a very real sense, indestructible. He cannot be manipulated because he does not need others' approval. He cannot be broken by failure because his self-worth is not dependent on outcomes. He cannot be controlled because he has learned to govern himself from within. This inner strength creates a gravitational field that naturally attracts others, particularly women who are unconsciously seeking the very emotional security that such a man provides. Understanding this dynamic, our inner strength in men intersects with the emotional needs we explored in women, reveals the pathway to creating relationships of extraordinary depth and satisfaction. Part 3. The synthesis of understanding and power. The convergence of these two profound psychological truths creates a map for navigating the complex terrain of human relationships with unprecedented effectiveness. When a man who has destroyed his weak self encounters a woman's fundamental need for emotional security, something remarkable occurs. Instead of two people locked in a dance of mutual neediness and manipulation, we find the foundation for a relationship of genuine strength, mutual respect, and deep satisfaction. This synthesis requires both parties to understand their own nature and that of the other. The woman must recognize her tendency toward relationship anxiety not as a weakness to be ashamed of, but as a fundamental aspect of her psychology that requires conscious management. The man must understand that providing emotional security is not about becoming a doormat or sacrificing his own needs, but about creating a stable foundation from which both partners can flourish. Consider the story of Michael and Elena, whose relationship exemplifies this powerful synthesis in action. When they first met at a professional conference, both had already done significant inner work on themselves. Michael, at 38, had spent his 30s systematically dismantling the false self he had constructed in his 20s. He had learned to derive his sense of worth from internal sources rather than external validation, had developed genuine confidence through facing his fears and limitations, and had cultivated the ability to remain centered regardless of external circumstances. Elena, at 34, had also undergone her own transformation. Through therapy and self-reflection, she had learned to recognize the anxiety patterns that arose whenever she perceived threats to her relationships. More importantly, she had developed tools for managing these patterns without allowing them to drive destructive behaviors. She had learned to communicate her needs clearly rather than expecting others to read her mind, and had cultivated sources of self-validation that reduced her dependence on external approval. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours, both of them amazed by the depth and authenticity of their connection. Michael was struck by Elena's emotional intelligence and her ability to express her thoughts and feelings with remarkable clarity. Elena was drawn to Michael's quiet confidence and his complete lack of the desperate neediness she had encountered in so many other men. As their relationship developed, they encountered the inevitable challenges that test every couple's foundation. The first significant test came 3 months into their relationship, when Michael had to travel extensively for work. In previous relationships, such separations had triggered Elena's abandonment fears, leading to anxious phone calls, accusations, and emotional meltdowns that ultimately drove her partners away. This time, Elena felt the familiar anxiety rising as Michael's departure date approached. The old voice whispered its familiar refrains: "He's going to meet someone else. He's going to realize he doesn't need you. The distance will make him forget about you." But instead of being overwhelmed by these thoughts, Elena recognized them as the predictable activation of her psychological wiring rather than accurate predictions about reality. She shared her concerns with Michael directly. "I need you to know that I'm feeling anxious about your trip," she told him. "It's not because I don't trust you, but because my brain is wired to interpret separation as potential abandonment. I'm managing these feelings, but I wanted you to be aware of what I'm experiencing." Michael's response demonstrated the power of a man who has destroyed his weak self. Instead of becoming defensive or trying to talk her out of her feelings, he acknowledged her vulnerability with compassion while maintaining his own center. "I understand why you're feeling that way," he said. "And I want you to know that my feelings for you aren't going to change because of physical distance. I'm committed to staying connected with you while I'm gone, and I'm committed to coming back to you." More importantly, Michael followed through on this promise. He called Elena every day at a consistent time, not because she demanded it, but because he recognized that this consistency would provide the emotional security she needed. His communications were warm and attentive, focused on maintaining their connection rather than simply reporting the events of his day. Elena, for her part, used Michael's absence as an opportunity to practice self-soothing and independence. Instead of sitting at home anxiously waiting for his calls, she filled her time with activities she enjoyed, spending time with friends, and pursuing her own interests. When anxious thoughts arose, she acknowledged them without judgment and redirected her attention to the present moment. When Michael returned, both of them had grown stronger. Elena had proven to herself that she could manage her anxiety without destructive behaviors, and Michael had experienced the satisfaction of being a source of strength and stability for someone he cared about. Their relationship had deepened rather than been damaged by the challenge. This pattern repeated itself through various trials: job stress, family conflicts, health scares, and financial pressures. Each challenge became an opportunity for both of them to demonstrate their growth and to strengthen their bond. Elena learned to share her vulnerabilities without being overwhelmed by them, while Michael learned to provide support without losing himself in the process. The key to their success lay in understanding that strength in relationships is not about eliminating vulnerability, but about managing it consciously and constructively. Elena's emotional sensitivity, rather than being a liability, became one of the qualities that made their relationship rich and deep. Her ability to read emotional nuances, to create intimate connections, and to foster closeness was directly related to the same psychological wiring that made her vulnerable to relationship anxiety. Similarly, Michael's independence and emotional stability, rather than creating distance, became the foundation that allowed Elena to feel secure enough to fully express her authentic self. Knowing that he would remain constant regardless of her emotional states gave her the freedom to experience and express her full range of feelings without fear of driving him away. Their intimate life flourished in ways that surprised both of them. Elena, feeling genuinely secure in Michael's love and commitment, was able to be more vulnerable and adventurous than she had ever been in previous relationships. Michael, not burdened by her anxiety or neediness, found himself naturally more generous and attentive. The positive cycle reinforced itself. The more secure Elena felt, the more freely she could love. The more freely she loved, the more motivated Michael became to provide that security. This dynamic extended beyond their romantic relationship into every aspect of their lives. Eleanor's natural nurturing instincts, no longer distorted by anxiety, made her an extraordinary partner in building their shared life together. She anticipated needs, created comfort, and fostered connection in ways that enhanced Michael's life immeasurably. Michael's stability and strength, freely given rather than demanded, created a sanctuary where Elena could pursue her own growth and ambitions without fear. They supported each other's individual development while building something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. Elena returned to graduate school to pursue a degree she had abandoned years earlier, confident that Michael's support would remain constant regardless of the time and energy her studies required. Michael took entrepreneurial risks he had previously been too cautious to attempt, knowing that Elena's emotional support would be there whether he succeeded or failed. Their friends and family often remarked on the quality of their relationship. There was an ease and naturalness to their interactions that spoke of deep compatibility and mutual respect. They didn't seem to work at their relationship in the exhausting way that characterizes so many couples. Instead, they seemed to naturally bring out the best in each other. The secret lay in their understanding of the psychological dynamics we have explored. By recognizing and working with their respective natures rather than against them, they had created a relationship that honored both the feminine need for emotional security and the masculine need for respect and independence. This understanding also protected them from the common pitfalls that destroy so many relationships. They avoided the pursuit-withdrawal dynamic because Michael understood that providing emotional security actually enhanced rather than threatened his independence, while Elena understood that Michael's need for space was not a rejection of their connection. They avoided the neediness trap because both had developed internal sources of validation that reduced their dependence on external approval. They avoided the control struggles that plagued many couples because they understood that true influence comes from attraction rather than coercion. Most importantly, they understood that relationships are not about finding someone to complete you, but about two complete individuals choosing to create something together. This understanding freed them from the desperate searching and clinging that characterizes so many modern relationships. Their story illustrates the broader principle that emerges from understanding these psychological truths. When we work with human nature rather than against it, when we develop strength in ourselves and respect the authentic nature of others, we create the conditions for relationships of extraordinary depth and satisfaction. The man who has destroyed his weak self becomes a source of strength not only for himself but for those around him. He provides the emotional bedrock that allows others to flourish while maintaining his own integrity and pursuing his own growth. The woman who understands her own psychological wiring can manage her vulnerabilities consciously while leveraging her natural strengths to create deep connections and nurturing environments. Together they create a dynamic that is both stable and growth-promoting, both secure and adventurous, both deeply connected and respectfully independent. They prove that understanding human nature, far from being a tool for manipulation or control, becomes the foundation for relationships of authentic love and mutual empowerment. This synthesis of psychological understanding and personal development offers a path forward for anyone seeking to create more satisfying relationships and a more authentic life. It requires courage to face our own weaknesses, wisdom to understand others' nature, and the discipline to consistently choose growth over comfort. But for those willing to undertake this journey, the rewards extend far beyond any single relationship, to encompass a way of being in the world that is both powerful and deeply satisfying. The man who destroys his weak self and the woman who understands her own nature become partners in the truest sense of the word. Two individuals who enhance each other's strength rather than exploiting each other's weaknesses. who support each other's growth rather than enabling each other's limitations, and who create together something more beautiful and powerful than either could achieve alone. And in this synthesis lies not only the secret to extraordinary relationships, but the pathway to living as fully realized human beings.